In some winters of the ancient world, a newborn child could lose dangerous amounts of body heat before sunrise, even while lying beside a living mother. Human infants were not born strong enough for the cold. They could not walk away from snow, gather wood, sew fur, or even shiver properly in their first days of life. And yet, long before hospitals, electricity, or insulated homes, people still carried fragile babies through ice seasons that killed full-grown adults. The strange part is that survival often depended on things that looked painfully small: a layer of animal fat rubbed onto skin, the shape of a sleeping space, the way breath moved beneath shared blankets, or the decision to keep a fire burning all night despite the risk of smoke. Across thousands of years, parents faced the same quiet fear each winter, not whether the cold was uncomfortable, but whether morning would come before the child's warmth disappeared. So how did human beings keep newborns alive in a world that seemed almost designed to take them away? For most of human history, winter did not arrive as a beautiful season. It arrived as a test of heat. The difference between life and death could be measured in tiny changes inside the body, often too small for anyone to see. A child becoming quieter than usual, fingers losing warmth, breathing slowing in the dark. Ancient parents did not understand thermodynamics or infant metabolism in scientific language, but they understood something simpler and more frightening. Babies became cold very quickly, and sometimes they did not recover. Human infants are unusually vulnerable compared to many other mammals. A foal can stand within hours. A newborn reindeer already carries a thick coat prepared for northern wind. Human babies arrive unfinished. Their brains continue growing rapidly after birth, but that growth comes with a cost. Much of a newborn's energy is directed inward, toward the development of the nervous system and the maintenance of basic body functions. Very little is left for surviving environmental extremes alone. In cold conditions, this weakness becomes dangerous almost immediately. A newborn loses heat faster than an adult because of simple body proportions. Small bodies have more surface area compared to their total mass. Heat escapes through skin continuously, especially when air is dry, windy, or damp. Adults can generate warmth through movement and muscle activity. Babies cannot. In fact, very young infants cannot even shiver effectively during their first weeks of life. Modern medicine understands this clearly. Newborns rely heavily on what is called brown fat, a special type of body fat that produces heat without shivering. Human infants are born with some reserves of this fat around the neck, shoulders, and upper back. It acts like a temporary survival system during the first stage of life. But brown fat is limited. If the surrounding cold continues too long, the body's defenses begin to fail. Thousands of years ago, no parent knew the term brown fat, yet they watched the same reality unfold every winter. A baby who stayed warm stayed alive more often. A baby exposed to cold for too long became silent, weak, difficult to wake, and sometimes impossible to save. This was not rare in harsh climates. In many ancient societies, winter infant mortality was painfully common. Archaeological evidence and historical records from later agricultural civilizations suggest that children under 1 year old faced the highest risk of death in difficult seasons, especially where food shortages and cold overlapped. Even in communities skilled at surviving winter, infants remained fragile in ways adults were not. The problem became worse at night. Darkness changed the behavior of heat itself. Temperatures dropped, fires weakened, wind moved differently through shelters, moisture gathered inside animal skins and woven coverings. During sleep, adults naturally reduced movement, meaning less body heat was generated. For a newborn lying still beside exhausted parents, several hours before sunrise could become the coldest period of the entire day. Ancient people slowly learned that surviving winter required more than enduring discomfort. It required protecting the body's invisible warmth every hour through the night. Much of early human shelter design, sleeping behavior, clothing, and childcare would eventually revolve around this quiet, biological fact. Not around comfort in the modern sense, but around preventing heat from leaving the smallest body in the group. Long before written history, mothers and fathers were already fighting a battle they could not fully see. They were trying to hold warmth inside a child whose body was not yet ready for the cold world surrounding it. The weakness of human infants in cold environments did not come from one single problem. It came from many small limitations happening at the same time. A newborn could not adjust clothing alone, could not move toward warmth, could not explain discomfort. Even crying, which helped adults notice distress, carried risks in freezing air because prolonged exposure could increase heat loss and exhaustion. Survival depended almost entirely on the awareness and habits of other people nearby. In prehistoric winters, this meant that the safety of a baby was deeply connected to the structure of the group itself. Anthropologists studying traditional cold weather societies have often noticed the same pattern repeating across different cultures, separated by thousands of miles. Infants were rarely left alone. They remained physically close to adults for most hours of the day and night. In many environments, this was not simply emotional attachment, it was practical temperature control. Human beings evolved as highly social creatures, and nowhere was that more important than in caring for newborns during cold seasons. Heat from multiple adult bodies could stabilize an infant's temperature better than open air, even inside shelters. A baby carried against the chest beneath animal hide or thick fabric experienced a warmer and more stable environment than a child placed separately nearby. Modern studies on skin-to-skin contact confirm that direct body contact helps regulate infant temperature, heart rate, and breathing. Hospitals today still use forms of this practice, especially for premature infants. Ancient people discovered its value through observation long before medical science explained why it worked. They learned through survival itself. In colder regions, this closeness shaped everyday life. Adults adjusted sleeping positions around children. Mothers often carried infants while walking, working, or gathering materials. In many nomadic groups, babies spent much of the day wrapped against the body where heat, movement, and breathing created a protected microclimate. The sound of a heartbeat, the rhythm of footsteps, and the constant exchange of warmth became part of the infant's earliest environment. To modern people, these details may appear gentle or emotional, but in difficult winters, they were also deeply practical. Cold air punishes stillness. Motion preserves circulation. Shared warmth reduces risk. Even the design of infant wrappings reflected this understanding. Archaeological evidence and historical observations suggest that many societies wrapped babies tightly, not only for carrying convenience, but to conserve heat and reduce exposed skin. Fur, wool, softened leather, woven grasses, and layered cloth all served variations of the same purpose. Trapping warmth close to the body mattered more than comfort in the modern sense. Loose coverings could allow cold air to circulate. Damp material could become dangerous. Dryness and insulation were closely connected. Snow itself was not always the greatest threat. Wetness often caused more danger because water pulls heat away from the body far faster than dry air. A damp infant in freezing weather could decline quickly. Ancient caregivers learned to fear moisture almost as much as wind. In some northern societies, considerable attention was given to keeping infant bedding dry through constant maintenance near fires or heated stones. These routines were repetitive and exhausting, especially during long winters when daylight remained short and fuel was limited. Yet generations continued them because experience had taught the same harsh lesson repeatedly. Small mistakes with warmth could become irreversible before morning. Human childhood is unusually long compared to other animals, and that long dependency may have strengthened social cooperation throughout human evolution. A fragile infant forced communities to organize around protection, shared labor, and collective survival. Winter revealed this reality more clearly than any other season. The youngest humans survived not because their bodies were prepared for the cold, but because other humans reshaped daily life around keeping them warm enough to endure it. For ancient families, winter nights often became long periods of listening, listening for movement inside darkness, listening for changes in breathing, listening for the small sounds that proved a child was still alive. In the modern world, temperature can be adjusted with a wall switch or a thermostat. Ancient people lived much closer to the limits of their environment. Cold entered shelters slowly, but continuously, especially after midnight when fires weakened and outdoor temperatures fell further. Adults understood these rhythms through experience. The deepest cold usually arrived before dawn, when fuel was low, bodies were tired, and darkness had already lasted many hours. For newborns, this stretch of night could become the most dangerous part of the day. Human infants use enormous amounts of energy simply maintaining body temperature. Modern pediatric research shows that when babies become cold, feeding often weakens, sleep changes, and breathing patterns can become unstable. Ancient parents did not have medical instruments, but they observed these patterns closely. A child who stopped waking to feed, who became unusually quiet, or whose skin felt cold around the hands and face, might already be slipping into danger. In societies without modern medicine, there was often very little that could reverse severe cold stress once it progressed too far. Prevention mattered more than treatment. This is one reason ancient caregiving became so constant during winter months. People could not afford long periods of inattention. Even sleep itself changed around infant survival. In many traditional societies studied by anthropologists, mothers woke repeatedly through the night to check children, adjust coverings, add fuel to fires, or reposition sleeping bodies closer together. These interruptions were exhausting, especially during seasons already burdened by food shortages and limited daylight. Yet, over generations, these behaviors became normal parts of survival. Winter childcare was not separate from survival work. It was survival work. The emotional weight of this reality likely shaped family life in ways difficult for modern people to fully imagine. Today, infant death in cold weather is relatively rare in most developed regions because heating, insulated housing, dry clothing, and emergency medicine reduce many ancient dangers. But for most of history, families lived with uncertainty every winter. Historical records from later civilizations show that many children died before reaching adulthood, with infants facing the highest risks. The causes varied: disease, malnutrition, infection, but cold intensified all of them. A weakened child became more vulnerable to freezing. A freezing child became weaker against illness. The body's systems were connected in ways ancient people could observe, even without scientific terminology. Over time, this constant exposure to infant fragility influenced human culture itself. Many societies developed rituals around birth that reflected uncertainty about survival during the first weeks or months of life. In some places, newborns were not formally named immediately. In others, mothers and infants remained close to protected indoor spaces during the earliest period after birth. These traditions differed across cultures, but they often reflected the same underlying truth. Early life was delicate, especially during winter. Yet there is another side to this history that is easy to overlook. The survival of human infants in severe climates also demonstrates how adaptable human communities became. People learned to observe tiny details with extraordinary care: the warmth of skin, the dryness of bedding, the position of a sleeping child near embers, the movement of air through cracks in walls or animal hides. Long before written science, ancient families gathered practical knowledge through repeated generations of attention. Most of that knowledge was never written down. It survived through habits, routines, and quiet warnings passed from older people to younger ones. A mother adjusting fur around a child before sleep may not have known anything about metabolism or heat transfer, but she understood the result of cold. Somewhere in her memory, or in the memory of the community around her, there were winters that had already taught the lesson. The survival of infants in the ancient world depended not on a single invention, but on thousands of careful human decisions repeated night after night against the pressure of the cold. Long before insulated walls or woven blankets became common, the oldest source of warmth available to human beings was another human body. For ancient families living through severe winters, this was not simply comforting, it was essential. Every living body produces heat continuously through metabolism. In cold environments, people learned that survival improved when this heat was shared instead of lost into open air. Adults slept close together. Children remained near parents. Infants were often kept directly against skin or beneath shared coverings for much of the night. Modern people sometimes imagine prehistoric sleep as isolated individuals lying beside fading fires inside caves or rough shelters. In reality, surviving cold usually required closeness. Archaeologists and anthropologists studying traditional cold-weather societies have repeatedly observed how sleeping arrangements were shaped by temperature rather than privacy. Human beings naturally create warmer microenvironments when gathered together. Even simple body proximity reduces exposure to moving cold air. Shared warmth also slows the rate at which heat escapes from smaller, more vulnerable bodies. This mattered especially for infants, because newborns lose heat rapidly during sleep. During waking hours, adults could react to cold by walking, adjusting clothing, gathering wood, or eating food for energy. Babies could do none of these things. Their warmth depended almost entirely on the people holding them. In many ancient communities, a newborn rarely spent long periods separated from adult contact. Carrying infants against the chest or back helped conserve heat while allowing adults to continue daily tasks. At night, sleeping close served a similar purpose. The human chest produces significant warmth because of blood flow near the surface and the constant work of the heart and lungs. A baby resting near that warmth experienced more stable body temperature than one placed alone nearby. Modern neonatal care still uses skin-to-skin contact for premature and low-weight infants because direct human warmth improves temperature regulation and supports calmer breathing patterns. Ancient people understood the practical value of closeness without needing medical explanation. Winter taught them through observation. A child who remained warm through the night was more likely to survive until spring. This reality shaped family behavior deeply. In some societies, entire households slept within a single enclosed structure during cold seasons, not only because building materials were limited, but because concentrated body heat improved survival for everyone inside. Smaller shelters retained warmth more effectively. Crowded sleeping spaces, which may seem uncomfortable by modern standards, often created safer conditions for infants than larger, empty interiors. Breath itself added warmth and moisture to enclosed spaces. Layers of animal hides, woven mats, and shared coverings trapped that warmth near sleeping bodies. These environments were far from luxurious. Smoke from fires could irritate lungs and eyes. Airflow was often poor. People shifted positions constantly during the night. Yet the alternative, outside the shelter, was usually far worse. Ancient survival often involved choosing manageable dangers over deadly exposure. The role of mothers became especially important during winter infancy because maternal body heat, feeding, and constant contact worked together as one survival system. Breastfeeding itself provided warmth through prolonged physical closeness. A nursing infant spent large amounts of time pressed directly against another living body. In cold climates, this closeness may have carried even greater importance than modern people realize. Separation meant rapid heat loss. Contact meant stability. Older family members likely contributed as well. Grandmothers, siblings, and other adults may have shared carrying duties or sleeping space, helping maintain warmth when mothers were exhausted or weakened by limited winter nutrition. Human infant survival was rarely the work of one individual alone. It depended on cooperation inside the group. The smallest child in the shelter often survived because many people adjusted their own comfort around that child's needs. Long before scientific knowledge of body temperature existed, humans had already built daily life around one simple truth: warmth could be shared, and shared warmth kept infants alive. The longer historians and anthropologists studied traditional winter societies, the clearer one pattern became. Human beings survived cold not as isolated individuals, but as groups that stayed physically close for long periods of time. This closeness affected nearly every part of daily life. Meals were shared beside heat sources. Work was often done within enclosed spaces during severe weather. Sleep itself became collective. For infants, this social structure was not simply cultural behavior. It functioned as protection against temperature loss. In many ancient environments, the safest place for a newborn was inside the center of human activity, surrounded by warmth, movement, sound, and breathing. Modern homes create separate spaces for sleep, privacy, and quiet. Ancient shelters were usually different. A single room might contain sleeping bodies, tools, stored food, drying hides, smoke from fires, and animals nearby for additional warmth. To modernize, these spaces might appear crowded or uncomfortable, but from the perspective of winter survival, compact living reduced heat loss. Large empty rooms are difficult to warm. Small enclosed spaces containing multiple bodies retain heat more effectively. Some northern and steppe societies even structured sleeping positions intentionally, with children and infants placed toward warmer central areas, while stronger adults occupied colder outer positions near entrances or walls where drafts entered. Over generations, these arrangements became habits passed through families without written instruction. Human warmth was treated almost like another resource to manage carefully during winter. The body itself became part of the shelter. This collective warmth also affected emotional behavior around infants. In cold climates, babies often remained in constant view of adults. They were watched, touched, adjusted, and repositioned throughout the day. The idea of placing a newborn alone in a separate cold space for many hours would have been impractical or dangerous in many ancient environments. Even brief exposure to severe cold could matter. Wind entering through shelter gaps or moisture soaking into wrappings might lower an infant's temperature quickly. Adults responded by maintaining almost continuous physical awareness of the child. This level of attention may help explain why many traditional societies developed highly responsive caregiving patterns around newborns. Crying was answered quickly not only from affection, but from necessity. A distressed infant could lose warmth through movement and exposed skin. A baby left unattended too long might slip into dangerous cold before dawn. Winter encouraged vigilance. There is also evidence that human sleep itself adapted to group survival. People likely woke frequently during the night in ancient shelters. Fires needed maintenance. Weather conditions changed. Infants required feeding and repositioning. Unlike modern sleep environments designed for uninterrupted rest, prehistoric winter nights were often active in quiet ways. Someone stirred embers. Someone checked coverings. Someone shifted closer to a child. These interruptions created a rhythm of collective maintenance that continued hour after hour until daylight returned. Survival depended on repeated small actions rather than a single dramatic effort. The role of breathing inside enclosed shelters may have mattered more than ancient people realized. Groups sleeping closely together increased ambient warmth and humidity slightly within confined spaces. Though poorly ventilated shelters carried risks from smoke and low air quality, completely open exposure to winter air was often far more dangerous. Ancient people constantly balanced these competing threats. Too much airflow removed heat, too little airflow trapped smoke. Every shelter became a compromise between warmth and breathable air. Infants sat at the center of this balance because they were the least capable of surviving mistakes. Anthropologists studying Arctic and subarctic groups have documented how carefully infants were wrapped and monitored during winter travel or sleep. The same concern appears across many unrelated cultures because the biological problem remained the same everywhere. Human babies are fragile in cold conditions. The solution developed repeatedly across history was not isolation, but closeness. The warmth of many bodies together allowed human communities to survive climates that individual humans alone could not endure for long. In this way, winter may have strengthened one of the deepest patterns in human evolution. People survived harsh environments by turning survival into something shared. For ancient parents, warmth was never fully guaranteed. Even when families slept close together, winter still entered slowly through walls, roofs, and ground beneath the body. Fires weakened during the night. Fuel became scarce near the end of long cold seasons. Wet clothing or damp animal hides could quietly pull heat away from the skin for hours. Because of this, caring for infants required more than simple closeness. It required constant adjustment. Ancient people learned to notice small physical signs that modern technology now measures with instruments. They watched skin color, they touched the face and hands, they listened to the strength of crying, they paid attention to feeding behavior and sleep patterns. These observations became part of ordinary life because winter punished delayed reactions. A healthy infant usually moved, fed, and responded regularly. A dangerously cold infant often became strangely quiet. Modern medicine recognizes this as one of the warning signs of hypothermia in newborns. Ancient people may not have known the biological mechanism, but they understood the danger through experience repeated across generations. Silence in the night could feel more frightening than crying. In many traditional societies, adults slept lightly around newborns. Mothers especially developed highly fragmented sleep patterns because infants needed frequent feeding and monitoring. This constant waking may have unintentionally improved infant survival during winter by reducing the amount of time a child remained unchecked. Feeding itself helped preserve warmth. Digestion produces heat, and breast milk provided both calories and hydration necessary for maintaining body temperature. A baby feeding often during cold nights had a better chance of remaining stable than one too weak or cold to nurse properly. Ancient families likely noticed this connection long before understanding why it happened. Winter also shaped the physical ways people carried children. In cold regions, infants were commonly wrapped close to the adult body during travel, instead of being transported separately. The adult became both transportation and insulation at the same time. Breath, heartbeat, body movement, and layers of fabric or fur created a narrow pocket of warmer air around the child. Some traditional carrying systems placed infants beneath outer clothing layers, reducing exposure to wind almost completely. This closeness was exhausting for caregivers during long migrations or daily labor, but separating a newborn from body heat for extended periods carried greater risk. Even older children sometimes slept close to babies to add warmth during severe cold. Human survival became deeply cooperative at the level of simple body heat exchange. There were dangers in this closeness as well. Modern discussions about infant sleep often focus on risks associated with unsafe sleeping environments, and those risks were likely present in ancient societies too. Yet, prehistoric people faced a different balance of dangers. Extreme cold itself threatened survival every night. Families made decisions within the limits of the environments they lived in. They chose the practices most likely to keep infants warm enough until morning. In many cases, close physical contact remained one of the few reliable methods available. Archaeological evidence alone cannot fully capture these quiet nighttime routines, but surviving traditional practices from cold weather societies offer clues. Many communities developed elaborate systems of layered bedding, shared sleeping platforms, enclosed sleeping spaces, and carefully arranged coverings. These were not luxuries, they were survival technologies built from observation. Long before written science explained heat transfer, people understood that trapped warmth mattered, small spaces mattered, dry materials mattered, human closeness mattered. Winter slowly trained human communities to become experts at preserving fragile warmth in fragile bodies. Over thousands of years, this knowledge became woven into ordinary behavior so deeply that many people no longer thought of it as knowledge at all. It simply became the way parents cared for children when cold seasons arrived. Somewhere inside those routines was an understanding carried quietly across generations. A newborn child could not survive winter alone. The warmth needed to stay alive had to come from other people first. At some point in human history, fire stopped being only a source of light. It became a way to protect the weakest members of the group from the cold itself. Long before metal stoves, chimneys, or insulated homes existed, a controlled flame inside or near a shelter could change the survival chances of an infant during winter nights. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans have used fire for hundreds of thousands of years, though the exact timeline of regular controlled use remains debated among researchers. What is clearer is that once human communities learned to maintain fire consistently, life in colder environments became more possible. Fire extended waking hours after sunset, helped cook food into more digestible forms, dried wet materials, frightened predators, and most importantly during winter, produced stable heat in a world where natural warmth disappeared every night. For infants, this changed everything. Before controlled fire, body heat alone placed strict limits on how cold an environment human groups could safely endure with newborn children. Fire created a second source of survival warmth that did not depend entirely on physical contact. Yet ancient fire was never simple or effortless. Keeping flames alive through long winters required constant labor. Wood had to remain dry. Fuel had to be gathered even during storms or deep snow. Embers needed protection from wind and moisture. In many early societies, allowing a fire to die completely may have created serious danger because restarting it without modern tools could be difficult and time-consuming. Some cultures carried smoldering materials during travel, specifically to preserve the ability to restart flames quickly. The importance of fire became especially clear after sunset. During daylight, movement and physical work generated body heat naturally. At night, activity slowed and temperatures dropped. Fires replaced some of the warmth lost when human bodies became still. Ancient shelters were often organized around this central heat source. Sleeping positions, storage areas, and even social interactions formed patterns around the fire's location. Infants and mothers were commonly placed closer to warmth, while entrances or colder outer areas were occupied by stronger adults. This arrangement reflected practical survival priorities. The smallest body required the most protection. Smoke filled many ancient shelters because ventilation systems remained primitive for most of human history. Modern people often imagine smoke only as discomfort, but prolonged smoke exposure can damage lungs and eyes, especially in enclosed spaces. Ancient families likely lived with constant irritation from indoor fires during winter months, yet they tolerated these conditions because exposure to severe cold carried immediate danger. In many environments, smoke became the lesser threat. Human beings repeatedly balanced competing risks to survive winter. Too little fire meant freezing. Too much smoke meant sickness. Somewhere between these extremes, families tried to create conditions stable enough for infants to survive until morning. Fire also transformed the materials surrounding babies. Wet animal skins could be dried near flames. Stones heated beside fires could warm sleeping spaces temporarily. Water for cleaning or softening materials became easier to prepare. Even food for nursing mothers became more digestible through cooking, indirectly helping infant survival by supporting maternal health during harsh seasons. The influence of fire reached nearly every part of winter childcare. Anthropologists studying traditional cold weather communities have documented how carefully people maintained nighttime embers. Open flames might die down while families slept, but glowing coals could preserve enough heat to restart stronger fires before dawn. This mattered because the coldest hours often arrived late in the night, when temperatures outside dropped further and sleeping bodies produced less active warmth. Ancient people learned to think ahead across the entire darkness of winter nights. A strong fire at sunset alone was not enough. Heat had to survive until sunrise. In this way, fire changed human relationships with cold itself. It allowed communities to remain in environments that would otherwise threaten infant survival too severely. But even after humans mastered fire, winter still demanded vigilance. A flame could warm a shelter, but it could not fully remove the fragility of newborn life in freezing conditions. The battle against cold simply became slightly more manageable, never completely won. Keeping a fire alive through winter was rarely a passive task. Ancient fires demanded attention almost constantly, especially during cold nights when infants depended on stable warmth the most. A strong flame at evening could fade into weak embers by midnight if fuel was limited or damp. Families learned that the danger often came slowly and quietly. A shelter that felt warm after sunset might become dangerously cold before dawn if the fire weakened unnoticed. In many traditional societies, at least one person likely woke repeatedly during the night to tend flames, reposition wood, or stir embers back to life. Sleep became divided into intervals of maintenance, rather than long, uninterrupted rest. Winter survival depended on routines repeated over and over in darkness. Firewood itself became one of the most important winter resources. Dry wood burns hotter, cleaner, and longer than wet wood, but obtaining dry fuel in snowy or rainy conditions could be difficult. Ancient people stored wood carefully whenever possible, sometimes inside shelters or beneath coverings to protect it from moisture. Small branches, bark, animal dung in treeless regions, peat, and dried grasses were all used as fuel in different environments depending on what the land provided. The type of fire mattered too. Fast-burning flames produced quick warmth, but disappeared rapidly. Dense wood or packed fuel burned longer through the night. Over generations, people learned which materials created stable heat and which failed during severe cold. These lessons were practical and immediate because infants could suffer first when warmth disappeared. Fire changed the rhythm of winter evenings as well. Before controlled indoor heat, darkness often forced people into inactivity because cold intensified after sunset. Fire created a central place where tasks could continue longer into the night. Clothing could be repaired, animal skins could dry, food could cook slowly. Infants could remain wrapped and warm while adults worked nearby. The glow of embers likely became associated with safety itself, especially for parents listening to winter winds outside thin shelter walls. Yet fire brought new dangers into human life. Open flames inside enclosed shelters increase the risk of accidental burns, particularly for crawling children or exhausted adults sleeping nearby. Smoke inhalation posed another serious problem. In shelters with poor ventilation, smoke accumulated close to the ceiling and sometimes lower depending on structure and weather conditions. Archaeological studies of ancient indoor fire use suggest long-term smoke exposure affected respiratory health in many populations. Infants, with smaller lungs and developing airways, were especially vulnerable. Families constantly balanced warmth against breathable air. Too much ventilation allowed precious heat to escape. Too little trapped smoke inside. Some shelters use small openings near roofs or entrances to release part of the smoke while preserving warmth, but these systems remained imperfect for most of history. There was also the danger of fire itself escaping control. A single spark could ignite dry bedding, animal fur, woven plant material, or stored supplies. Ancient shelters built from wood, grasses, hides, or packed earth varied in fire resistance, but all carried some risk. During winter, when people slept closer together and fuel burned continuously for long hours, exhaustion could increase the chance of accidents. Even so, most communities accepted these risks because cold exposure remained the larger threat. Without fire, many infants simply would not survive severe winters. Anthropologists studying traditional Arctic and northern communities have described how carefully people managed indoor heat. Some groups used stone-lined hearths that retained warmth after flames faded. Others heated stones directly and positioned them near sleeping areas beneath layers of material. Heated stones appear in archaeological evidence across multiple regions and time periods, suggesting humans repeatedly searched for ways to store warmth longer into the night. The goal was always the same: extend heat through the coldest hours before sunrise. Ancient people could not stop winter from arriving. They could not prevent snowstorms or freezing winds. But through constant labor around fire, they learned to build small islands of warmth within hostile environments. For infants sleeping beside those fires, survival often depended on whether enough heat remained alive until morning. Fire did more than warm ancient shelters. Over time, it changed the way human beings understood winter itself. Before reliable fire, cold was something people mostly endured directly with their own bodies. After fire became central to survival, warmth could be stored, protected, and extended beyond natural daylight. This altered how families organized evenings, where they slept, how they cared for infants, and even how far humans could move into colder regions of the world. Yet despite all these changes, fire never fully solved the problem of infant vulnerability. It only narrowed the distance between survival and danger. Ancient parents still lived with uncertainty every winter night. The warmth inside a shelter remained fragile because it depended on many unstable things at once: fuel supplies, dry weather, shelter design, human attention, physical exhaustion. One strong storm could disrupt all of them together. Snow blocking access to wood, heavy rain soaking fuel, sudden wind changing airflow through a shelter, or illness weakening caregivers could quickly reduce the effectiveness of fire as protection. In this sense, surviving winter remained a continuous process rather than a permanent achievement. Infants sat at the center of this fragile balance because they had the least ability to adapt when conditions changed. Adults could endure discomfort longer. Babies often could not. Archaeological discoveries from Ice Age and early human settlements suggest that people repeatedly returned to locations where shelter and fuel were reliable. Access to firewood mattered deeply in colder climates. Forest edges, protected valleys, and areas with available animal fuel sources often supported longer seasonal occupation. A winter shelter without nearby fuel could become dangerous quickly once stored materials ran low. In some environments, entire daily routines during cold seasons revolved around maintaining enough combustible material to survive future nights. Gathering wood was not separate from childcare. It was part of keeping children alive. Fire also influenced social behavior around storytelling, teaching, and memory. During long winter darkness, people gathered around warmth for many hours. Knowledge about weather, shelter repair, hunting routes, and infant care likely passed verbally between generations in these spaces. Younger adults watched older caregivers manage newborns through cold nights. They observed how bedding was arranged, how coverings were adjusted, how embers were protected until morning. Much of humanity's practical winter knowledge survived not through written instruction, but through repeated observation beside firelight. In this way, fire became connected not only to heat, but to continuity itself. The survival of one generation depended partly on what the previous generation had learned about surviving winter with children. Modern science now explains many dangers ancient people could only observe indirectly. Hypothermia in infants can develop faster than in adults because newborn bodies lose heat quickly and possess limited energy reserves. Smoke inhalation increases respiratory risks, especially in enclosed spaces. Damp conditions accelerate heat loss dramatically. Yet long before thermometers or medical textbooks existed, ancient families recognized these patterns through lived experience. They knew that cold infants became weak. They knew smoke could make breathing difficult. They knew damp bedding created danger. Their solutions were imperfect, but often surprisingly effective considering the tools available. Human survival in harsh climates depended less on mastering nature completely and more on reducing risk, little by little each night. Even now, traces of these ancient behaviors remain inside modern parenting instincts. Many people still check whether a sleeping baby feels warm enough. Parents still wake during the night to listen for breathing. Caregivers still wrap infants carefully against cold air and react quickly when small children appear chilled. Technology changed homes, but human concern around infant warmth never fully disappeared. Somewhere deep beneath modern life remains an ancient memory carried through behavior rather than words. Winter nights once demanded constant vigilance because warmth could fade silently while everyone slept. And for most of human history, the smallest body near the fire was usually the one most at risk when it did. Long before woven winter coats or insulated fabrics existed, ancient people depended heavily on animal materials to survive cold environments. Fur, hide, leather, feathers, and fat became some of the earliest forms of protection against heat loss. For infants, these materials were often the difference between enduring winter nights and succumbing to them. Human skin alone provides relatively poor insulation compared to many cold-adapted animals. Early humans compensated not by evolving thick fur, but by learning to borrow insulation from other species. This change altered human survival so deeply that many researchers believe advanced clothing played a major role in allowing people to expand into colder parts of Eurasia during prehistoric periods. Infants benefited from these developments perhaps more than anyone else. A newborn wrapped in animal fur retained warmth more effectively because fur traps layers of still air close to the body. Still air slows heat transfer. Wind, by contrast, strips warmth away rapidly by replacing warmer air near the skin with colder moving air. Ancient people may not have understood the physics involved, but they observed the results constantly. Fur-lined coverings stayed warmer. Wind penetrating thin material created danger. Over generations, families experimented with what worked best in different climates. Some animal skins handled moisture better. Some remained flexible in freezing temperatures. Others provided thicker insulation during deep winter conditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans prepared hides carefully, using scraping, stretching, drying, smoking, and softening techniques long before recorded history. These processes took significant labor, but untreated hides stiffened, rotted, or lost usefulness quickly in wet conditions. Winter survival depended not just on obtaining animal skins, but on maintaining them properly. For infants, softness mattered alongside warmth, because fragile skin could become damaged by rough or frozen material. Dryness remained equally important. Cold alone was dangerous, but cold combined with moisture became far worse. Water removes body heat much faster than air, especially when fabric or fur stays wet against the skin. Ancient caregivers likely spent enormous effort trying to keep infant wrappings dry during snow, rain, or long periods inside damp shelters. Animal skins near fires had to be dried carefully because too much heat could damage them, while too little allowed moisture to remain trapped. The daily maintenance of warm materials became part of winter childcare itself. Some northern peoples, later documented by explorers and anthropologists, used layered systems of fur clothing specifically arranged to trap heat efficiently while reducing moisture buildup. Though practices varied widely across regions and time periods, the principle remained similar. Warmth lasted longer when insulation stayed dry and air remained trapped near the body. Infants were often wrapped more completely than adults because their bodies lost heat faster and they moved less. Tight swaddling in some cultures may also have helped reduce exposed surface area and preserve warmth during sleep or travel. Another important resource came not from fur itself, but from animal fat. Many traditional cold weather societies used animal oils or fats on skin, leather, or materials to improve resistance against wind and moisture. Fat-based treatments could help waterproof surfaces partially, slowing the penetration of snow or damp air. Some groups applied oils directly to exposed skin during severe cold, though practices differed depending on environment and available resources. Animal fat also held enormous nutritional importance during winter because calorie-dense foods help the body generate internal heat. For nursing mothers, especially, access to sufficient fats and calories could influence both their own survival and their ability to continue feeding infants through harsh seasons. In this way, hunted animals provided multiple forms of winter protection at once. Their bodies became fuel, clothing, bedding, shelter coverings, tools, and warmth for human children. Ancient people did not separate these uses into different categories. Survival systems were interconnected. A successful hunt could improve infant warmth directly through fur and indirectly through food, fire, fuel transport, and stronger caregivers. Winter survival was rarely based on one invention alone. It depended on many layers of protection working together around the most vulnerable members of the group. Ancient people eventually learned that surviving winter depended not only on creating warmth, but on preventing warmth from escaping too quickly. This may seem obvious now, yet for early humans living without modern fabrics, insulation required constant experimentation with natural materials. Different climates forced people to develop different solutions, but one lesson appeared repeatedly across cold regions. Layers protected life better than a single covering alone. For infants, layering became especially important because their bodies changed temperature rapidly in response to the surrounding environment. A baby wrapped in several dry layers could preserve heat far longer than one exposed to moving air, damp surfaces, or frozen ground. Ground contact itself created hidden danger. Cold earth, stone, or packed snow steadily pulled heat away from sleeping bodies through direct contact. Ancient families learned to separate infants from the ground whenever possible using fur bedding, dried grasses, moss, feathers, woven mats, or raised sleeping surfaces. In Arctic and subarctic environments, some groups constructed thick bedding from animal skins with fur facing inward to trap warm air close to the child. Others used plant materials beneath hides to create additional insulation from frozen surfaces below. These arrangements required constant maintenance because compressed bedding lost some insulating ability over time, especially when damp. Much of winter childcare involved managing tiny changes in temperature and moisture before they became dangerous. Swaddling became another widespread practice connected partly to warmth preservation. Many societies wrapped infants tightly using cloth, leather strips, woven fibers, or animal skins. Modern discussions about swaddling often focus on comfort or sleep behavior, but in ancient cold climates, reducing exposed skin and conserving body heat may have been equally important reasons. A tightly wrapped infant loses less warmth through air circulation around the body, movement decreases, and insulating layers stay closer to the skin. Though practices varied widely across cultures, the practical relationship between wrapping and heat retention appears repeatedly throughout historical records. Some communities also designed infant carriers specifically to preserve warmth during travel. Babies were positioned close against the caregiver and surrounded by layered coverings that reduced wind exposure. During migrations or winter hunting movements, this portable insulation could mean survival. Exposure during travel remained especially dangerous because moving through snow or wind increased heat loss dramatically. Adults could often tolerate these conditions for limited periods through activity and muscle-generated heat. Infants remained almost entirely dependent on external insulation and human contact. Wind represented a constant enemy in cold environments because moving air removes the thin layer of warmth surrounding the body. Ancient clothing systems often focused less on thickness alone and more on blocking airflow. Fur positioned correctly, overlapping hides, and tightly wrapped openings around the head and limbs reduced the amount of cold air reaching the skin. Human beings lose substantial body heat through the head and neck when exposed, and infants with proportionally larger heads were especially vulnerable. This likely explains why many traditional infant wrappings emphasized covering the head carefully during winter conditions. Archaeological evidence cannot always reveal exactly how infants were dressed because soft materials decay over time, but surviving traditional practices from cold weather societies provide important clues. Many communities developed highly sophisticated winter clothing systems using only natural resources. Inuit groups, for example, later became known for layered animal skin garments remarkably effective against Arctic cold. Similar patterns of careful insulation appear across northern Eurasia and mountain regions, where winter survival depended on controlling heat loss continuously. None of these methods created perfect safety. Even the best fur coverings became dangerous if soaked. Strong winds could still penetrate openings. Fires could fail. Supplies could run low near the end of winter. Yet each improvement in insulation increased the chances that a child would survive another freezing night. Over generations, ancient families slowly transformed observation into practical technology. They learned which materials trapped warmth best, which absorbed moisture, which stayed flexible in cold, and which protected infants during sleep or travel. This knowledge was rarely written down. It survived because parents passed it directly to children who later became parents themselves, repeating the same careful preparations each winter against the returning cold. One of the quietest dangers of winter was not always extreme cold itself, but the slow loss of dryness. Ancient people eventually discovered that warmth and dryness were closely connected. A shelter could contain fire, fur, and many sleeping bodies, yet moisture alone could still weaken all of those protections. Snow melting into bedding, damp breath trapped inside coverings, wet animal hides drying too slowly near weak fires, or sweat freezing inside clothing during travel could gradually pull heat away from the body. For infants, whose temperature stability was already fragile, this process became especially dangerous. Modern science explains that water conducts heat away from the body much faster than air. Ancient people understood the same reality through repeated experience. A dry child remained warm longer. A damp child became cold quickly, even beside a fire. This is why winter survival often depended on constant maintenance rather than one-time preparation. Bedding had to be aired or dried. Wrappings needed replacement when wet. Fur had to remain clean enough to trap insulating air effectively. Fires were used not only for heating bodies, but for restoring dryness to the materials surrounding them. In many cold weather societies, preserving dry sleeping spaces became a daily responsibility. Some groups used moss, grasses, or absorbent plant materials beneath infants to help manage moisture. Others rotated bedding closer to heat sources during waking hours. These tasks may appear small from a modern perspective, but together they formed part of a larger system protecting children from gradual heat loss during winter nights. Animal fat also played a subtle role in managing moisture and cold. Beyond nutrition, fats and oils could help waterproof leather, soften stiff hides, and reduce wind penetration. In Arctic and northern maritime cultures documented in later centuries, animal oils were used carefully because water resistance could determine whether clothing remained useful in freezing conditions. Some traditional groups treated boots, gloves, or outer coverings with fats to prevent moisture absorption. Though exact prehistoric practices are difficult to reconstruct fully, archaeological and ethnographic evidence strongly suggests that ancient humans understood the practical value of keeping materials resistant to snow and damp air. Infants benefited indirectly from all of this labor because their coverings remained warmer and drier for longer periods. There was also another reason dryness mattered so much. Cold injuries often developed gradually rather than dramatically. Severe freezing temperatures could certainly kill quickly, but many winter dangers worked slowly over hours. Slightly damp bedding, slightly weakened fire, slightly colder airflow entering a shelter. A newborn losing small amounts of heat continuously throughout the night might appear calm at first. Ancient parents likely learned to fear these subtle changes because they were difficult to reverse once the child became deeply chilled. This may explain why so much winter caregiving involved repetitive checking and adjustment. The battle against cold was rarely won once and for all. It had to be maintained hour after hour. In some traditional northern societies, people became highly skilled at judging environmental conditions through touch and observation alone. They noticed how fur felt when holding moisture. They recognized dangerous wind patterns around shelters. They understood how quickly snow melted into dampness near body heat. This knowledge was practical science built through generations of survival, much of it centered around protecting the vulnerable, especially infants who lacked the physical reserves to tolerate mistakes for long. Winter survival also changed the emotional meaning of ordinary objects. A dry animal hide was not merely material, it represented warmth through the night. A stable fire meant breathing children by morning. A carefully wrapped infant reflected many hours of hidden labor from multiple people gathering fuel, preparing skins, maintaining shelters, and preserving food. Human beings survived severe cold not because nature became gentler, but because communities slowly learned how to control small environmental details around fragile bodies. Long before modern heating systems existed, parents were already fighting an invisible battle against heat loss, using whatever the natural world provided. Fur, fat, dryness, layering, fire, and constant attention became parts of the same quiet effort. Keep enough warmth inside the child until sunrise returns again. Many people imagine ancient shelters as naturally warm places that protected families easily from winter weather. In reality, early shelters often remained cold, smoky, damp, and difficult to manage during severe seasons. A cave could block wind but still hold freezing air, A hut with a fire inside could still lose heat rapidly through cracks, thin walls, or exposed entrances. Ancient people survived, not because their shelters were comfortable, but because they slowly learned how to reduce heat loss little by little. For infants, these small improvements mattered enormously. One of the most important discoveries in human shelter building was that stopping wind could matter more than raising temperature itself. Moving cold air removes warmth from the body far faster than still air. A windy shelter could feel dangerously cold even beside a fire. This is why many ancient winter shelters were built low to the ground, with narrow entrances and compact interiors. Smaller enclosed spaces trapped body heat and fire warmth more effectively than large open areas. Lower ceilings also helped because warm air rises. In a tall shelter without insulation, much of the heat gathered above the sleeping area, instead of remaining near people on the ground. Ancient builders may not have known the physics involved, but they observed the outcome repeatedly. Certain structures stayed warmer through the night, others failed during storms. Over generations, practical designs survived because families inside them survived more often too. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age Europe, Siberia, and Arctic regions suggests humans experimented constantly with shelter forms suited for harsh climates. Some groups used mammoth bones, animal hides, wood frames, packed earth, turf, or snow, depending on available resources. Each material had strengths and weaknesses. Thick earth walls reduced wind penetration and stabilized temperature changes. Animal hides blocked drafts but required maintenance against moisture and tearing. Snow itself, surprisingly, could function as insulation because trapped air inside compacted snow slows heat transfer. Later, Arctic peoples would refine this principle into highly efficient snow shelters during travel or hunting. The ground beneath shelters created another hidden problem. Frozen earth slowly absorbed heat from sleeping bodies all night long. Ancient people learned to create barriers between themselves and the ground, using layers of grasses, branches, fur, moss, or raised platforms. Infants especially needed protection from below because their small bodies lost heat quickly through direct contact. Sleeping directly on cold surfaces for long periods could gradually lower body temperature, even when wrapped in coverings. This may explain why so many traditional winter sleeping systems used multiple layers beneath children rather than relying only on blankets above them. Shelter entrances were also carefully considered in many cold regions. Doorways facing prevailing winds allowed cold air to sweep directly inside. Some groups built angled entrances, tunnels, or partial barriers to reduce airflow. Others used hanging hides or layered coverings over openings during storms. Even small reductions in wind exposure could improve warmth noticeably inside compact shelters. Ancient people became highly sensitive to air movement because they lived close to the physical realities of heat loss every winter. The placement of fire inside shelters reflected this same careful balance. Too close to sleeping areas created danger from sparks and smoke. Too far reduced warmth where it was needed most. Smoke management remained difficult for much of history because fully sealing shelters trapped dangerous air, while increasing ventilation released precious heat. Winter shelter design became an ongoing compromise between warmth, breathable air, dryness, and safety. Infants existed at the center of all these decisions because they tolerated environmental stress poorly compared to adults. A shelter good enough for strong adults might still fail to protect a newborn through freezing nights. This reality forced ancient communities to think carefully about space itself. Walls, bedding, entrances, ceilings, airflow, and sleeping positions all became part of a larger survival system built around preserving warmth in vulnerable bodies. Human beings survived cold climates not by eliminating winter, but by learning how to shape small pockets of stability inside it. As winter knowledge deepened across generations, ancient people began shaping entire living spaces around one invisible goal: hold warmth inside for as long as possible. This affected not only the materials used for shelters, but also their size, location, and relationship to the landscape itself. A poorly placed shelter could lose heat continuously, no matter how strong the fire inside. A carefully placed one could remain noticeably warmer with the same amount of fuel. In cold environments, geography became part of survival. Valleys blocked wind better than exposed ridges. Forest edges offered fuel and protection from storms. South-facing slopes in northern regions sometimes received longer sunlight during winter days, slightly reducing cold exposure. Ancient communities paid close attention to these details because their lives depended on them year after year. Some of the most effective winter shelters were partially built into the earth itself. Earth changes temperature slowly compared to open air. Below the surface, temperatures remain more stable through both day and night. By digging downward or building walls against packed earth, ancient people reduced exposure to freezing wind and rapid heat loss. Archaeological evidence from several cold climate societies shows repeated use of semi-subterranean homes during winter months. These structures often appeared low from the outside, but inside they created protected spaces where body heat and fire warmth remained trapped more efficiently. For infants, this stability mattered enormously because sudden temperature changes placed extra stress on already fragile bodies. Thick walls also helped regulate moisture. Condensation and damp air remained constant challenges inside winter shelters, especially where many people slept close together near fires. Materials like turf, packed soil, wood, and layered vegetation provided some insulation against both cold and moisture when maintained properly. Yet no shelter remained perfect for long without constant repair. Snow accumulation, melting ice, smoke damage, and strong wind slowly weakened structures through the season. Ancient families spent significant energy maintaining walls, patching openings, replacing coverings, and reinforcing entrances. Shelter building was never truly finished during winter. It became an ongoing process of protecting warmth from slowly escaping into the surrounding cold. The placement of sleeping areas inside shelters reflected careful observation too. Warm air from fires and human bodies did not distribute evenly. Certain corners became colder because of airflow patterns or contact with outer walls. Infants were often kept farther from entrances where cold drafts entered each time someone moved outside. In some traditional societies studied later by anthropologists, raised sleeping platforms improved warmth by lifting bodies away from freezing ground while concentrating shared heat in smaller spaces above floor level. Families adjusted positions during storms or severe cold, moving closer together to preserve warmth more efficiently. Even silence inside shelters mattered at times. Openings created for ventilation could carry wind noise, smoke movement, and cold air deep into sleeping areas. Ancient people likely became highly aware of environmental sounds because those sounds signaled changes in airflow and weather conditions outside. A sudden shift in wind direction during the night might force families to adjust coverings, reinforce entrances, or protect fires from being extinguished. Winter demanded continuous awareness of the shelter itself as a living space that interacted constantly with the environment outside. Children born into these conditions entered a world already shaped by generations of survival decisions. They slept inside structures designed not for comfort in the modern sense, but for preserving human warmth against relentless cold. Every part of the shelter carried hidden meaning. Low ceilings trapped heat. Thick bedding blocked cold rising from the ground. Narrow entrances reduced drafts. Stored fuel near the wall meant fire could survive until dawn. Layers of hide hanging across openings slowed wind enough to protect sleeping infants nearby. None of these details alone guaranteed safety. Together, however, they created conditions where fragile newborns had a better chance of surviving winter nights. Ancient shelter design was less about building permanent homes and more about managing energy carefully inside hostile climates. Human beings learned that survival often depended on controlling small environmental details surrounding the weakest members of the group. And among all those details, warmth remained the most precious resource inside the shelter after darkness fell. Even the best ancient shelters could never fully separate people from WUTA. Cold still entered slowly through walls, ground, smoke openings, and every small movement of air. Storms could last for days, trapping families inside crowded spaces where fuel, food, and breathable air became increasingly difficult to manage. For infants, survival depended not only on the shelter itself, but on the constant effort required to keep that shelter functioning under pressure. Winter homes were less like permanent protection and more like fragile systems that demanded attention every day. Ancient people learned this through repeated experience across generations. A neglected shelter slowly became dangerous even if it appeared solid from the outside. One major problem was moisture accumulating indoors. Fires produced heat, but they also created smoke and condensation, especially in enclosed spaces filled with breathing bodies. Snow carried inside on boots, animal skins, or firewood melted gradually near heat sources. Dampness gathered in bedding and along walls. Over time, this moisture reduced the effectiveness of insulation and increased the risk of heat loss during sleep. Families fought a constant battle to keep interior spaces dry enough to preserve warmth. In some traditional winter shelters, smoke openings were adjusted depending on weather conditions to balance ventilation against heat retention. Too much opening allowed warmth to escape. Too little trapped smoke and moisture inside. There was rarely a perfect solution. Ancient life often meant managing imperfect compromises carefully enough to survive until seasons changed. Infants remained especially sensitive to these environmental shifts because they spent much of their time inside the shelter. Adults moved outdoors for hunting, gathering fuel, repairing structures, or tending animals. Babies stayed closer to bedding, coverings, and indoor air for long periods. This meant that the quality of the shelter's internal environment mattered deeply for infant health. A cold draft crossing a sleeping area repeatedly through the night could slowly lower body temperature. Damp bedding beneath an infant could remove heat continuously for hours. Smoke accumulating near ground level might irritate fragile lungs and weaken breathing. Ancient caregivers likely observed these dangers without fully understanding the biological mechanisms behind them. They noticed which sleeping spots stayed warmer, which areas collected moisture, which weather conditions made infants restless or unusually quiet. Over time, practical knowledge about indoor survival became highly detailed. Shelter maintenance also consumed enormous amounts of labor during winter. Roof coverings required repair after storms. Packed snow barriers needed rebuilding after wind erosion. Stored fuel had to remain dry despite changing weather. Animal hides used as walls or coverings stiffened, cracked, or loosened with repeated freezing and thawing. Ancient families could not simply retreat indoors and remain passive through winter. The shelter itself demanded continuous work to remain protective. In many ways, maintaining warmth became a full-time responsibility shared across the group. Children growing up in these environments learned early that survival depended on noticing small changes before they became serious problems. There is evidence from multiple cold region societies that people intentionally reduced unused interior space during severe winter periods. Temporary partitions, lowered sleeping areas, or concentrated sleeping arrangements helped preserve warmth around occupied spaces. Empty air inside large shelters represented wasted heat. Human bodies and fires warmed compact spaces more effectively when everyone stayed close together. This practical understanding shaped winter social life deeply. Families gathered tightly not only from tradition or companionship, but because closeness conserved energy. Throughout all of this, infants remained at the center of winter planning. Their weakness forced communities to think carefully about airflow, insulation, dryness, sleeping arrangements, and fire maintenance. A shelter that protected adults imperfectly might still support survival. A shelter that failed infants threatened the future of the group itself. Long before architecture became associated with comfort or status, human shelter design carried a more immediate purpose: create enough stability against the cold for vulnerable children to survive another winter night. The walls, roofs, fires, and bedding of ancient shelters were all part of the same quiet promise repeated across generations. Hold the warmth inside until morning comes again. Keeping a baby warm during winter required more than fire, shelter, and animal skins. It also required food. Heat inside the human body is closely connected to energy consumption. Every heartbeat, breath, and movement depends on calories being transformed into warmth and biological activity. For infants, whose bodies were growing rapidly while also struggling to maintain stable temperature, the need for steady nourishment became especially important during cold seasons. Ancient people may not have understood metabolism scientifically, but they recognized a simple truth through experience. Weak or hungry babies became cold more easily, and cold babies often stopped feeding well. The two dangers reinforced each other. Breast milk was one of the most important survival resources available to newborns in the ancient world. It provided calories, hydration, immune protection, and physical warmth through close body contact during feeding. In winter conditions, breastfeeding likely carried even greater importance because it helped stabilize infants in several ways at once. A nursing child remained pressed against another warm body while receiving concentrated nutrition that could be digested relatively easily. Human milk also changes composition over time and can contain high fat content, important for supporting growth and energy needs in early infancy. Modern science now explains these processes in detail, but ancient caregivers already understood the practical result. Infants needed regular feeding to remain strong during cold weather. Winter, however, made feeding more difficult for entire communities. Food shortages were common near the end of long cold seasons when stored supplies diminished and hunting or gathering became harder. Nursing mothers faced enormous physical demands. Their own bodies needed sufficient calories and hydration to continue producing milk, while also maintaining personal warmth in freezing environments. If mothers became malnourished, exhausted, or ill, infant survival could quickly become uncertain. Ancient societies developed many cooperative behaviors around this reality. In some communities, extended family members helped protect nursing mothers from the harshest labor during the earliest months after birth. Other adults gathered fuel, prepared food, repaired shelters, or cared for older children so mothers could remain close to infants. Human infant survival often depended on shared effort surrounding the mother-child pair. The body of the mother became part of the winter survival system itself. Historical and anthropological records from later traditional societies also show that women sometimes nursed children for extended periods compared to many modern populations. Long breastfeeding intervals may have provided advantages in environments where alternative infant foods carried high risks from contamination, poor nutrition, or cold exposure. For much of history, there were no reliable substitutes for human milk during the earliest stage of life. Animal milk was not always safe or digestible for very young infants, especially without modern sanitation. In severe winter conditions, a baby losing access to breastfeeding faced immediate danger not only from hunger, but from declining ability to maintain body heat. Ancient families likely feared maternal illness deeply for this reason. There were also practical challenges connected to feeding during freezing weather itself. Exposed skin lost heat rapidly, especially during wind or nighttime cold. Mothers feeding infants inside winter shelters still had to balance warmth, smoke, dampness, and exhaustion at the same time. A crying, hungry infant might require feeding repeatedly throughout the night, while fires weakened and temperatures outside continued dropping. Sleep fragmentation became normal for caregivers because infant feeding schedules could not pause during winter storms. The body's need for nourishment continued every few hours, regardless of weather conditions. Some anthropologists believe the human tendency toward cooperative child-rearing became especially important in harsh climates, where one exhausted caregiver alone might struggle to maintain both infant feeding and all other survival tasks simultaneously. Gathering wood, preparing food, maintaining shelter warmth, and protecting children required continuous labor. Communities that shared these burdens likely improved infant survival more successfully over generations. In this way, feeding a newborn during winter was never simply about hunger. It was part of the larger struggle to preserve warmth, strength, and life inside a body too fragile to survive cold conditions alone. Winter exposed one of the harshest biological realities of ancient life. A baby could survive only if the adults around that child remained strong enough to continue caring for it. This was especially true for mothers nursing newborns during long cold seasons. Human milk production requires large amounts of energy, fluids, and physical stability. In environments where food became scarce during winter, the burden placed on nursing women could become extreme. Ancient communities may not have measured calories or nutrients scientifically, but they observed the consequences clearly. Exhausted mothers weakened, weak mothers produced less milk, hungry infants became more vulnerable to cold and illness. The survival of the child and the condition of the mother were deeply connected. Seasonal food shortages affected many ancient societies differently depending on climate and geography. In northern regions, winter often reduced access to fresh plant foods and made hunting more unpredictable. Snow, ice, storms, and animal migration patterns could interrupt food supplies for long periods. Communities depended heavily on stored foods, preserved fats, dried meat, smoked fish, grains, or whatever resources local environments allowed people to save before cold weather arrived. These reserves were never guaranteed to last comfortably until spring. By late winter, some groups likely experienced periods of hunger repeatedly across generations. During these times, nursing mothers faced difficult physical strain because their bodies prioritized infant feeding even while their own energy reserves declined. Anthropologists studying traditional societies have documented how communities often directed valuable foods toward pregnant women, nursing mothers, and young children whenever possible. High-fat foods carried special importance in cold climates because fat provides concentrated energy the body can convert into heat. Animal fat, marrow, oily fish, and preserved meat became crucial winter resources in many northern environments. Without sufficient energy intake, the human body struggles to maintain warmth efficiently. For infants already vulnerable to cold, reductions in feeding quality or frequency could quickly increase danger. Ancient people likely noticed that babies became weaker during seasons of food stress, long before understanding the metabolic reasons behind it. Winter also increased the physical workload required simply to survive. Fuel gathering, snow management, hunting, repairing shelters, maintaining fires, preparing clothing, and preserving bedding all demanded energy. Nursing mothers often continued participating in many of these tasks despite exhaustion. In nomadic or semi-nomadic groups, Migration during cold seasons added even greater strain because infants had to be carried while adults traveled through snow, wind, or freezing rain. Human survival in severe climates depended partly on the remarkable endurance of caregivers who continued protecting children while under constant environmental pressure themselves. Yet ancient communities rarely survived through individual effort alone. Cooperative support became one of humanity's most important survival strategies. Grandparents, older siblings, relatives, and unrelated group members often contributed labor that indirectly protected infants by reducing stress on mothers. Someone gathered fuel while another repaired coverings. Someone watched older children while the mother rested briefly with the newborn. In some societies, wet nursing may have occasionally occurred when another lactating woman fed a child whose mother was sick, injured, or deceased. Historical records from later civilizations show examples of this practice, especially during periods when infant survival without breast milk was uncertain. The death or illness of a nursing mother could place an infant in immediate danger during winter because safe alternative feeding methods were extremely limited. Ancient people lived close to this reality constantly. There was also an emotional dimension to winter feeding that rarely appears in archaeological evidence but likely shaped family life deeply. Feeding an infant during severe cold was not simply routine care. Each successful feeding may have carried reassurance that the child remained warm enough, awake enough, and strong enough to continue surviving. A baby refusing milk in winter could signal danger quickly. Parents listened for swallowing sounds in darkness. They monitored body warmth through touch while nursing near fading fires. Long before scientific medicine, feeding became one of the clearest signs that life inside the child was still holding steady against the cold. In this way, nourishment and warmth became inseparable parts of the same struggle. Ancient people were not only trying to fill empty stomachs during winter, they were trying to keep fragile bodies producing enough heat to endure another freezing night. For some ancient families, the greatest winter fear was not the storm outside the shelter, but the possibility that a baby would lose access to nourishment before spring arrived. Human infants are born unusually dependent compared to many mammals, and during the earliest months of life, regular feeding is tied directly to warmth, growth, hydration, and immune protection. If feeding failed, cold often became harder to survive. Ancient people learned this through painful experience repeated across generations. A hungry infant weakened faster in winter. A weakened infant lost body heat more easily. Once the cycle began, recovery could become difficult without stable care and nutrition. When mothers became severely ill, injured, malnourished, or died, ancient communities faced extremely difficult choices. Before modern infant formula or sanitation systems existed, feeding a newborn without breast milk carried serious risks. Animal milk was sometimes used in later agricultural societies, but very young infants often struggled to digest it safely, especially when mixed with contaminated water or stored improperly. In freezing conditions, even preparing substitute foods could become dangerous because warmth, cleanliness, and regular feeding schedules were difficult to maintain consistently. Some historical records from ancient and medieval periods describe attempts to feed infants, softened grains, diluted animal milk, or broths when breastfeeding was unavailable, but survival rates were uncertain, especially for very young babies. This likely explains why many traditional societies valued cooperative childcare so strongly. A child's survival sometimes depended on whether another adult could help provide nourishment and protection after maternal illness or death. Wet nursing became one solution in some cultures. A lactating woman might nurse another child temporarily or permanently if the infant's mother could no longer do so. Historical evidence for wet nursing appears across many civilizations, from ancient agricultural societies to later urban cultures. In small prehistoric communities, Similar forms of shared infant feeding may have occurred when circumstances demanded it, though direct evidence is difficult to recover archaeologically. Human beings survived harsh environments, partly because caregiving responsibilities could sometimes extend beyond biological parents alone. This flexibility increased the chances that vulnerable infants would survive periods of crisis. Winter intensified every challenge surrounding infant feeding because cold increased energy demands continuously. Babies required frequent nourishment not only for growth, but for maintaining body temperature through long nights. Adults facing hunger themselves still had to preserve enough strength to carry wood, maintain fires, repair shelters, and protect sleeping spaces. Exhaustion accumulated slowly across the season. Ancient winter life rarely involved dramatic moments of survival. More often, it involved enduring countless small tasks while trying not to let conditions deteriorate too far. Feeding an infant every few hours through freezing nights became part of this exhausting rhythm. There were also emotional realities connected to winter infant care that ancient people likely carried quietly. In societies where infant mortality remained common, parents still formed deep attachments to children despite the uncertainty surrounding survival. The sound of feeding during darkness may have brought reassurance. A warm child nursing normally beside the fire signaled temporary stability against the cold outside. Ancient caregivers learned to recognize these fragile moments of safety and hold on to them carefully. Anthropologists studying traditional societies have sometimes noted how attentively adults monitored infant behavior during harsh seasons. Small changes in feeding, crying, sleep, or body warmth could alter the mood of an entire household because everyone understood the risks connected to decline. Through all of this, one truth remained constant across climates and centuries. Human infants survived winter not because they were naturally prepared for cold conditions, but because other people continuously adapted around their weakness. Food, warmth, shelter, carrying, feeding, and shared labor all work together as one connected system. Remove one part, and the entire balance became fragile. Ancient communities did not always succeed in protecting every child. Winter could still overcome even careful preparation, but generation after generation, people continued building routines, habits, and forms of cooperation around the same quiet goal: keep the child nourished enough to stay warm until the season finally changes. In cold ancient environments, one of the safest places for a newborn was often not inside a cradle or resting place, but against another human body in motion. Human infants lose heat rapidly when left still and exposed, especially during winter. Ancient people learned that carrying children close to the body helped preserve warmth more reliably than leaving them separated for long periods. As a result, babies in many traditional societies spent much of their early lives being held, wrapped, or carried, while adults moved through daily survival tasks. Warmth traveled with the child because the caregiver became part of the shelter itself. Movement mattered for another reason as well. Adult bodies generate heat continuously through muscular activity. Walking, gathering fuel, preparing food, repairing shelters, or traveling through snow all increased warmth inside the caregiver's body. A baby carried close against the chest or back benefited from this heat production indirectly. Layers of fur, cloth, leather, or woven fibers trapped warm air between the adult and infant, creating a protected space less exposed to freezing wind. Anthropologists studying traditional cold weather cultures have repeatedly documented carrying systems designed not only for convenience, but for thermal protection. Some infants were wrapped beneath outer clothing layers entirely, with only small openings left for breathing and observation. Others rested inside fur-lined carriers, positioned close to the adult's core body heat. These methods reduced wind exposure while allowing caregivers to continue necessary work during winter conditions. Ancient people understood through experience that separation from warmth, even briefly, could become dangerous for very young children. Carrying also allowed adults to monitor infants constantly. A baby pressed against the body could be checked through touch, movement, breathing, and feeding behavior without needing separate attention every few minutes. Caregivers noticed changes in warmth or responsiveness quickly because the child remained physically connected to them for long stretches of time. This constant monitoring became especially important during severe cold, when infants could weaken quietly. Modern medicine recognizes that hypothermia in newborns may begin with subtle symptoms, such as reduced movement, weak feeding, unusual sleepiness, or quietness. Ancient caregivers observed the same patterns long before scientific explanations existed. The body itself became an instrument for detecting danger. A child who suddenly felt colder, less active, or strangely still against the chest could trigger immediate concern. Winter likely sharpened human sensitivity to these small physical changes. Nighttime created additional challenges because movement naturally slowed during sleep. During the day, active adults generated heat through labor and travel. At night, bodies rested and external temperatures often dropped further. This may explain why ancient sleeping arrangements frequently kept infants close to adults even while sleeping. Warmth generated during the day could not simply be stored indefinitely. It had to be maintained continuously through shared body heat, coverings, fire maintenance, and repeated repositioning during the night. In some traditional societies documented later in history, caregivers slept lightly beside infants and responded quickly to small movements or sounds. Deep, uninterrupted sleep may have been rare during harsh winters because the survival of children required ongoing attention. Carrying infants close also reduced exposure to another winter danger, cold air moving across the face and lungs. Freezing wind could stress breathing, especially for newborns with developing respiratory systems. Keeping children beneath coverings near warm adult breath created a more stable air environment during travel or outdoor activity. Even the rhythm of adult breathing may have helped regulate infant breathing patterns indirectly during close contact. Modern neonatal studies on skin-to-skin care suggest that infants often stabilize physiologically when held close to caregivers. Ancient people discovered the practical benefits of this closeness through repeated survival rather than laboratory science. Over thousands of years, these habits became deeply woven into human behavior. A parent instinctively pulling a child closer during cold weather may carry echoes of ancient survival knowledge passed silently through generations. In winter environments where fire could fail, shelters could leak cold air, and food supplies could weaken, the human body itself remained one of the most reliable sources of warmth available to an infant. To carry a child close was not only affection, it was protection against the cold world surrounding them. Winter forced ancient parents into a state of near constant awareness. In modern heated homes, adults can often assume a sleeping baby will remain physically stable for many hours. Ancient people rarely had that certainty during severe cold. Fires changed strength through the night. Wind shifted unexpectedly around shelters. Moisture gathered slowly inside bedding. An infant who seemed warm before sleep could become dangerously cold before dawn if conditions changed unnoticed. Because of this, many caregivers likely developed extremely light and fragmented sleep patterns during winter months. Their attention remained partly awake even while resting. Human beings are naturally responsive to infant sounds, movement, and breathing, but harsh climates may have intensified this sensitivity further. A weak cry, unusual silence, or change in breathing rhythm could carry serious meaning in cold environments. Ancient parents probably learned to wake quickly at small disturbances because delays carried consequences. Modern research shows that caregivers, especially mothers of young infants, often sleep more lightly and remain more responsive to infant noises. In ancient winter shelters, this biological tendency may have improved survival. Adults sleeping near newborns could react sooner when a child became cold, hungry, restless, or unusually still. Many nighttime routines likely revolved around repeated checking, adjusting coverings, repositioning sleeping bodies closer together, feeding infants, stirring fires back to life, feeling the warmth of a child's skin in darkness. These actions became ordinary parts of surviving winter rather than separate caregiving tasks. The body of the caregiver functioned almost like an alarm system tuned constantly toward the infant nearby. Breathing held special importance during these long nights. Human infants naturally breathe irregularly at times, especially during early life. Ancient people would not have understood infant respiratory physiology scientifically, yet they almost certainly listened closely to breathing sounds in darkness because silence could become frightening. A baby breathing steadily beside the warmth of sleeping adults represented stability. Weak breathing, unusual stillness, or lack of movement might signal danger from cold stress or illness. In shelters where visibility remained poor, after fires dimmed, sound and touch became critical forms of monitoring. Parents likely learned to recognize subtle differences in normal sleep sounds through repeated experience. The fear of cold-related decline may also explain why infants in many traditional societies remained physically close to adults nearly all the time, even during sleep. Physical contact allowed caregivers to sense changes quickly through touch alone. A child becoming colder, less responsive, or unusually limp could be noticed before visible signs became severe. Modern neonatal care still emphasizes temperature monitoring because newborns can deteriorate faster than adults under cold stress. Ancient people lacked medical instruments, but they compensated through constant proximity and observation. Winter nights also changed the emotional atmosphere inside shelters. Darkness lasted longer, outdoor movement became harder. Families spent more time together in enclosed spaces listening to weather outside thin walls. During storms, entire groups may have remained awake intermittently through the night, feeding fires and checking conditions. Infants became central points of concern because everyone understood their vulnerability. In some ways, the survival of the youngest child measured how well the group itself was enduring the season. Anthropologists studying traditional Arctic and northern communities have described highly attentive caregiving behaviors around infants during cold periods. Caregivers checked body warmth frequently, adjusted wrappings carefully, and responded rapidly to crying or discomfort. These behaviors were not signs of anxiety in the modern sense. They were practical adaptations shaped by generations living close to environmental danger. Ancient parents did not monitor infants constantly because they believed winter was dramatic or mysterious. They did it because cold could work quietly. Heat left the body slowly. Weakness developed gradually. By the time severe symptoms appeared, recovery might already be difficult. Over thousands of winters, human beings adapted not by becoming physically resistant to cold like fur-bearing animals, but by becoming exceptionally attentive to one another. The ancient winter shelter was filled not only with smoke, fire, and layered bedding, but with listening. Listening for movement beside fading embers, listening for feeding sounds in darkness. Listening for the small, steady breath that meant the child was still warm enough to survive until morning. Over thousands of years, winter changed not only how ancient people built shelters or cared for infants, but how they organized attention itself. Human beings became a species that survived by watching one another closely. This was especially true during the earliest stage of life, when a newborn could not communicate danger clearly or protect its own body from cold. Ancient caregivers learned to notice tiny details because survival often depended on them. A child sleeping too quietly, skin feeling cooler near the neck or hands, feeding becoming slower than usual, restlessness during a storm. These signs may have appeared small, yet repeated generations of winter taught families that small changes could become serious before sunrise arrived. Many traditional societies developed caregiving habits that kept infants within constant sensory range. Adults carried children close enough to feel movement through layers of clothing. Babies slept near breathing bodies rather than far away. Caregivers listened for feeding sounds even while half asleep beside fading embers. Winter encouraged a style of parenting built around continuous awareness rather than distance. This did not emerge from modern theories about emotional bonding. It emerged because environmental conditions punished inattention quickly. In freezing climates, there was little margin for error with newborn children. The connection between movement and warmth also shaped infant care deeply. Babies who remained motionless for long periods lost heat steadily, while infants carried against moving adults experienced more stable warmth through transferred body heat and reduced exposure. Ancient caregivers likely noticed that children became colder faster when left alone in still air. As a result, winter childcare often involved keeping infants physically integrated into daily activity. A mother gathering wood, preparing food, or adjusting shelter coverings could still keep the child close against her body. Even ordinary movement became part of the infant's protection system. Anthropologists studying traditional cold weather cultures have often described how infants remained woven into community life rather than separated into specialized spaces. The child traveled where warmth traveled. This constant contact also allowed rapid response when conditions changed suddenly. Winter weather could shift quickly. Wind direction changed. Fires weakened. Dampness spread through bedding. Snow entered shelters unexpectedly during storms. Ancient caregivers became skilled at adapting minute by minute to preserve stable warmth around vulnerable children. A covering might be tightened, a sleeping position adjusted, a baby moved closer to another adult. These actions happened repeatedly throughout the day and night until they became automatic. Human beings survived severe climates partly because caregiving evolved into a form of environmental management focused around fragile bodies. There was exhaustion in this system too. Constant vigilance wears heavily on the body and mind, especially during long winters with limited daylight and difficult living conditions. Ancient parents likely carried deep fatigue through many cold seasons. Yet the routines continued because they worked often enough to preserve life. Human survival rarely depended on perfect safety. More often, it depended on reducing danger gradually through repeated small actions. Every adjusted blanket, rekindled ember, nighttime feeding, and careful touch added slightly to the infant's chances of reaching spring alive. Modern technology has changed many parts of winter life, but traces of these ancient survival patterns still remain in human behavior. Parents instinctively place hands on sleeping children to check warmth. Adults wake easily at infant cries, even in deep sleep. Caregivers pull blankets higher around children during cold nights without fully waking. These responses feel natural, partly because generations of human beings survived by remaining highly responsive to vulnerable infants during dangerous seasons. Long before science explained body temperature or infant physiology, ancient people built systems of care around observation, touch, movement, and closeness. Winter shaped those systems slowly across thousands of years. Beneath the smoke, darkness, and cold of ancient nights, one quiet human behavior kept repeating itself. Someone staying awake just long enough to make sure the child beside them was still warm. For most of human history, winter survival was never guaranteed, even for healthy adults. For infants, the danger was far greater. Archaeological evidence and historical records from many ancient societies suggest that infant mortality was often high, especially during periods of severe climate stress, famine, disease, or migration. Ancient people lived with this reality constantly. They did not expect every child to survive automatically, because survival depended on many fragile conditions remaining stable at once: warm shelter, reliable fire, dry bedding, sufficient food, healthy caregivers, protection from illness. A failure in any one area could place newborn children at serious risk during winter months. Yet despite this harsh reality, human communities continued investing enormous effort into protecting infants. This reveals something important about ancient life. Children were not treated as unimportant simply because mortality was common. In fact, the amount of labor directed toward infant survival suggests the opposite. Entire systems of shelter building, food storage, clothing preparation, fire maintenance, and caregiving revolved partly around preserving the youngest lives through dangerous seasons. Winter exposed how dependent human survival truly was on cooperation across generations. Ancient burial evidence provides some quiet clues about the emotional weight of infant loss. In many prehistoric and ancient societies, infants were buried carefully, sometimes with objects, coverings, pigments, or placement near living spaces. Practices varied widely across cultures and time periods, but these burials suggest attachment, grief, and recognition of the child as part of the community. Modern people sometimes imagine ancient humans as emotionally distant because death occurred more frequently. The evidence does not support that assumption clearly. People can become familiar with danger without becoming emotionally untouched by it. A winter illness, failed harvest, or weakened newborn may have been common experiences historically, but they still carried human sorrow each time they occurred. Cold environments made survival unpredictable in ways modern societies rarely experience. A healthy infant could decline rapidly after exposure to dampness, infection, hunger, or prolonged cold stress. Ancient caregivers had limited medical tools to reverse these conditions once severe symptoms appeared. This uncertainty shaped how communities approached winter preparation. Extra fuel mattered because fires sometimes failed. Additional food storage mattered because storms interrupted hunting. Spare hides and dry bedding mattered because moisture spread unexpectedly. Much of ancient winter labor involved preparing for the possibility that conditions would worsen suddenly. Infant survival depended heavily on whether the group had enough reserves to absorb these disruptions without collapsing into crisis. Migration periods created particular danger for newborns. Some hunter-gatherer and nomadic groups could not remain permanently in one location year-round because food availability changed seasonally. Traveling through snow, freezing rain, strong wind, or unstable terrain placed additional stress on infants and caregivers alike. Movement exposed children to cold air repeatedly while also exhausting adults responsible for carrying them. Anthropologists, studying later traditional societies, observed that travel with very young infants during severe weather was often avoided when possible because of these risks. But environmental pressures did not always allow safe timing. Ancient people sometimes moved because remaining where they were became even more dangerous. Winter forced difficult choices between competing threats. Disease also interacted with cold in important ways. Crowded shelters, smoke exposure, poor ventilation, malnutrition, and physical exhaustion could weaken resistance to respiratory illness or infection. Infants with developing immune systems were especially vulnerable. Modern medicine now explains how cold stress, nutrition, and indoor air quality affect health, but ancient people understood the practical outcomes through observation. Certain winters were remembered as harder than others. Some seasons brought more illness, more weakness, more deaths among children. Communities carried these memories forward as warnings and survival knowledge. Even in the harshest conditions, however, ancient humans continued adapting. They refined shelter designs, improved clothing systems, shared caregiving responsibilities, protected food stores more carefully, monitored infants more closely during storms and illness. Human survival in cold climates was never a story of perfect mastery over nature. It was a story of gradual learning passed across generations while living beside constant uncertainty. Every child who survived winter represented not only luck, but thousands of small acts of preparation, labor, observation, and care working together against the cold. Ancient people understood that winter could change suddenly from difficult to deadly. A season that began with stable shelter, healthy children, and enough food could deteriorate quickly after repeated storms, failed hunts, spreading illness, or exhaustion inside the group. For infants, these periods of accumulated stress were often the most dangerous because newborn survival depended on many small protections remaining in place continuously. Once several protections weakened at the same time, the body of a young child could decline rapidly. This is one reason why ancient communities became deeply attentive to warning signs during winter. They learned to fear gradual deterioration as much as sudden disaster. Hunger often arrived slowly near the end of cold seasons. Stored food supplies shrank week by week, while hunting remained uncertain. Adults weakened from months of physical labor and reduced nutrition. Fires consumed remaining fuel reserves faster during prolonged storms. Dampness spread through heavily used bedding and clothing. Illness moved more easily among people crowded inside enclosed shelters for long periods. Each problem alone might be manageable. Together, they could overwhelm a family's ability to protect vulnerable children. Ancient people likely noticed that the hardest part of winter was often not the beginning, but the long endurance required afterward. Infants suffered especially during these periods because their survival systems had little reserve capacity. A healthy adult could sometimes survive hunger, cold exposure, or illness for days or weeks. A newborn often could not. Historical records from later agricultural societies describe seasonal increases in infant deaths during periods of famine, extreme cold, or disease outbreaks. While prehistoric evidence is harder to interpret precisely, researchers believe similar patterns likely existed far earlier in human history. Winter intensified every biological weakness at once. Cold increased calorie needs. Food shortages reduced available energy. Smoke exposure weakened lungs. Crowded shelters increased infection risks. Exhausted caregivers had less physical strength to maintain constant attention. Ancient communities responded to these dangers by developing strong habits of preparation whenever possible. Fuel was collected before severe storms arrived. Food was dried, smoked, or stored carefully before winter deepened. Animal skins were repaired before freezing weather returned. Sleeping spaces were reinforced repeatedly against drafts and moisture. Much of ancient survival depended on anticipating future weakness before it arrived. This may explain why many traditional societies placed enormous importance on seasonal preparation rituals and communal labor before winter. People understood that once severe cold fully settled in, opportunities to recover from mistakes became limited. The emotional atmosphere inside shelters likely changed during difficult winters as well. Caregivers watching infants weaken from illness, hunger, or cold stress faced uncertainty without modern medicine or reliable treatment options. Ancient people could provide warmth, food, rest, and close attention, but some conditions still progressed beyond their ability to reverse. The helplessness surrounding infant illness may have shaped many cultural beliefs, rituals, or protective traditions connected to children and winter seasons. Even societies without written science understood that young life remained fragile when resources declined too far. Yet winter also revealed another side of human behavior. Cooperation often intensified under pressure. Anthropological studies of traditional societies frequently show increased sharing of food, labor, shelter space, and childcare during harsh conditions. Groups that distributed resources more flexibly may have improved survival rates during difficult seasons compared to isolated individuals or families struggling alone. Human beings survived cold climates, partly because communities learned to absorb hardship collectively. An exhausted mother might receive help carrying fuel. A hungry child might be fed from shared stores. A damaged shelter might be repaired through group labor before storms worsened. These actions did not eliminate suffering, but they reduced the likelihood that one weakened person would collapse entirely under winter pressure. Through thousands of years, ancient people slowly built survival systems around this understanding. No individual body, especially the body of an infant, could resist severe winter alone for long. Survival depended on many people sustaining one another through repeated small acts of preparation, observation, and shared labor. In the darkness of difficult winters, human communities became strongest not when they eliminated vulnerability, but when they learned how to carry it together. By the end of a long winter, ancient shelters often carried signs of exhaustion everywhere. Fuel reserves were smaller, animal skins became worn from constant use, bedding held lingering smoke and moisture despite repeated drying attempts. Adults moved more slowly after months of interrupted sleep, physical labor, and reduced food supplies. Infants who survived to this stage of winter had already passed through countless small dangers that modern people rarely notice in daily life. Every warm night beside the fire represented many hidden acts of maintenance, holding the fragile system together a little longer. Ancient people understood that winter was not survived once. It was survived repeatedly, day after day, until the season finally loosened its grip. The arrival of warmer weather likely brought enormous physical relief to human communities. Snow melted, daylight lengthened, fresh water and plant foods became easier to access in many regions. Hunting conditions improved for some groups as animal movement changed with the season. Fires no longer needed to burn as intensely every night to prevent freezing. Most importantly for infants, maintaining body warmth required slightly less constant effort. A child who survived until spring often entered a safer period biologically because older infants gradually regulate body temperature more effectively than newborns. Time itself became part of survival. Every week a child remained alive increased the chances of enduring the next season. This may explain why ancient communities placed such importance on protecting infants through the earliest months of life, especially during harsh winters. Archaeological and anthropological evidence suggests that human populations adapted to cold climates slowly across thousands of years through both cultural learning and social cooperation. There was no single invention that solved the problem of winter infant survival permanently. Fire helped, but required fuel and maintenance. Shelters reduced wind exposure, but trapped smoke and moisture. Fur and layered coverings improved insulation, but failed when wet. Food storage supported mothers and children, but supplies could run low. Every solution carried limits. Human beings survived because they kept adjusting these systems constantly instead of relying on one perfect answer. Winter forced flexibility into human behavior. Communities that adapted carefully tended to survive more successfully over generations. This long history may still shape human instincts today in subtle ways. Modern parents often worry about whether infants are warm enough while sleeping. Caregivers still wake during the night to check breathing or adjust blankets. People continue associating warmth with safety, comfort, and protection during illness or vulnerability. These behaviors are not simply cultural habits disconnected from the past. They may reflect survival patterns repeated across thousands of winters when paying attention to warmth truly determined whether a child reached morning alive. Ancient people likely carried memories of difficult winters for many years afterward. A season with severe storms, food shortages, illness, or infant deaths would influence future preparation deeply. Communities remembered which shelters failed, which fuel supplies ran out too quickly, which routes became dangerous during snow, and which caregiving practices protected children more effectively. Human survival knowledge accumulated gradually through memory, long before written records existed. Grandparents passed observations to younger adults beside fires during later winters. Children who once survived cold nights wrapped in fur eventually became caregivers themselves, repeating lessons learned through experience rather than formal teaching. In this way, winter shaped not only bodies, but culture, memory, and relationships between generations. Perhaps this is one of the quietest truths hidden inside ancient winter survival. Human infants did not endure freezing climates because humans became physically stronger than winter. In many ways, people remained biologically fragile compared to animals naturally adapted to severe cold. Human survival depended instead on attention, cooperation, preparation, and the ability to protect weakness collectively. A newborn child survived because many people carried pieces of the burden together. Someone maintained the fire, someone repaired the shelter, someone preserved dry bedding, someone gathered food before storms arrived, someone stayed awake in darkness listening for breathing beside fading embers. Through countless winters across human history, survival often came from these ordinary acts repeated patiently, night after night, until warmth returned to the world again. As human societies slowly changed from small mobile groups into larger farming communities, winter infant survival changed with them. Agriculture created new forms of stability in some ways. Stored grain, domesticated animals, permanent shelters, and predictable settlement patterns allowed families to remain in one place longer instead of moving constantly with seasonal food sources. Yet these changes also introduced new dangers for infants during cold seasons. Permanent settlements gathered more people together in enclosed spaces for longer periods of time. Smoke, illness, poor sanitation, food shortages, and overcrowding could spread more easily during winter months. Ancient farming life did not automatically make survival safer. In some cases, it created entirely new risks that earlier hunter-gatherer groups faced less often. One major change involved population density. Small mobile groups rarely kept large numbers of people inside tightly packed shelters for extended periods because movement naturally limited crowding. Agricultural villages and early towns concentrated families together season after season. During winter, people spent even more time indoors near fires and shared sleeping spaces. This increased exposure to respiratory illnesses, especially among infants whose immune systems remained immature. Smoke from indoor fires continued damaging lungs, but now infectious diseases could also circulate more efficiently between households and neighboring families. Archaeological studies of ancient settled populations often show evidence of nutritional stress, infection, and shorter average health quality compared to some earlier mobile hunter-gatherer groups. Stability brought benefits, but it also changed the biological pressures surrounding childhood survival. Food storage created another complicated shift. Farming communities could preserve grain and domesticated animal products across seasons, reducing some immediate risks of starvation during winter. However, stored food supplies were vulnerable to spoilage, rodents, moisture, theft, and crop failure. A single poor harvest could threaten entire settlements because larger populations depended heavily on concentrated food systems. In mobile societies, groups sometimes adapted by moving toward better resources. Permanent settlements had fewer options once winter arrived. Infants suffered first when stored food quality declined because nursing mothers weakened under nutritional stress and substitute feeding methods remained unreliable for very young children. Ancient farming societies likely experienced cycles where some winters passed safely while others brought severe hardship after droughts, floods, or failed harvests. Shelter design also evolved with settled life. Permanent structures built from wood, mud, brick, stone, or packed earth often provided better wind protection than temporary shelters. Some homes included central hearths, storage areas, and more stable sleeping arrangements. Yet permanent indoor fire use created long-term smoke exposure problems. Archaeological evidence from ancient homes suggests soot accumulation and poor ventilation remained common for much of human history. Infants raised near indoor fires inhaled smoke repeatedly during winter months, potentially increasing vulnerability to respiratory illness. Ancient people probably recognized that smoke could irritate breathing, but they accepted the trade-off because cold exposure remained dangerous without indoor heat. Winter still forced people into balancing one risk against another. Agricultural life also changed the rhythms of labor surrounding childcare. Farming required intense seasonal work during planting and harvest periods, but winter often shifted focus toward maintenance, repair, food management, weaving, tool preparation, and caring for animals indoors. Women nursing infants frequently worked within these household spaces while continuing childcare responsibilities at the same time. Babies remained physically close to adults because survival still depended on warmth, feeding, and constant observation during cold weather. Despite changes in technology and settlement patterns, the biological vulnerability of infants remained largely unchanged. A newborn still lost heat quickly, still required regular feeding, still depended on adults waking through the night to maintain warmth and safety. Ancient societies became more complex over time, but winter continued exposing the same fundamental weakness inside human life. No shelter, village, or food system fully removed the fragility of early childhood. Even as civilizations grew larger, parents still listened for breathing in dark rooms beside fading fires. Communities still feared harsh winters after poor harvests. Caregivers still wrapped infants carefully against cold air, moving through cracks in walls. The tools changed slowly across history, but the central struggle remained remarkably similar. Human beings were still trying to keep small, vulnerable bodies warm enough to survive until spring returned once again. As settlements grew into larger villages and early cities, winter survival became connected not only to family preparation, but also to the stability of entire social systems. A small hunting group facing food shortages could sometimes relocate or divide temporarily to reduce pressure on resources. Large agricultural communities had fewer options once winter began. Hundreds or thousands of people might depend on the same grain stores, water sources, fuel supplies, and animal reserves through long, cold months. When these systems failed, infants often became among the first to suffer because their bodies tolerated stress poorly compared to older children or adults. Ancient records from later civilizations describe winters marked by hunger, disease, and rising child mortality after crop failures or severe weather. Though prehistoric evidence remains less detailed, the underlying biological pressures were likely similar across many periods of human history. Fuel shortages became especially dangerous in settled communities. Permanent homes required regular heating during cold seasons, particularly in northern climates. Woodlands near growing settlements could become depleted over time, forcing people to travel farther for fuel or rely on lower quality combustible materials. Poor fuel meant weaker fires, more smoke, and colder shelters. For infants sleeping through long winter nights, small reductions in indoor warmth could gradually increase danger. Ancient people likely understood this relationship deeply because entire communities prepared fuel reserves carefully before winter arrived. A family entering cold months with insufficient wood or dried fuel faced constant anxiety once temperatures dropped. Disease also became more complex in larger populations. Permanent settlements allowed illnesses to circulate repeatedly rather than disappearing when small groups moved apart seasonally. Respiratory infections spread more easily through crowded indoor winter spaces where smoke exposure already stressed lungs and weakened breathing. Infants and young children remained especially vulnerable because their immune defenses were still developing. Historical records from ancient civilizations mention waves of sickness during winter periods, though people rarely understood the exact causes biologically. They observed patterns instead. Some winters brought more coughing, fever, weakness, and child deaths than others. Communities responded with practical adaptations where possible. Ventilation openings were adjusted, fires maintained more carefully. Sick individuals sometimes isolated when conditions allowed. Yet without modern medicine, many infections remained difficult to stop once they spread inside crowded settlements during cold weather. Social inequality may also have influenced infant survival, increasingly as societies became more stratified. Wealthier households in some ancient civilizations could potentially access better shelter materials, larger food reserves, thicker bedding, domesticated animal products, or additional labor support during winter. Poorer families likely faced greater exposure to hunger, dampness, and overcrowding. Archaeological studies from certain ancient urban centers suggest differences in nutrition and health between social classes, including among children. Winter did not affect all people equally once resources became unevenly distributed inside larger societies. Even so, across every level of society, the biological needs of infants remained remarkably consistent. Warmth, feeding, dry shelter, close attention, protection from illness. Human civilization changed dramatically over time, but newborn vulnerability remained almost unchanged from prehistoric eras. A baby born inside an early farming village still depended on adults waking during cold nights to maintain fire and warmth. Parents still listened for breathing. Caregivers still feared severe winters after poor harvests. Families still wrapped infants tightly against freezing air and dampness. The scale of human society expanded, yet winter continued reducing survival down to intimate physical realities inside homes and shelters. Ancient writings from some civilizations even reveal how deeply winter infant survival shaped emotional life. Parents prayed for healthy children during harsh seasons. Protective rituals surrounded newborns. Fires were treated with special importance during cold months. Though beliefs differed across cultures, many societies recognized winter as a period when life became especially fragile. Human beings developed religions, governments, cities, and trade networks, but beneath all of that complexity remained the same quiet struggle repeated since prehistoric times. Keep vulnerable children warm, nourished, and breathing through the coldest nights of the year. Civilization advanced slowly around that ancient responsibility without ever fully escaping it. Across thousands of years of human history, one pattern remained surprisingly consistent. Winter repeatedly exposed how dependent human life is on cooperation, preparation, and care for the vulnerable. Technologies changed slowly, shelters improved, clothing became more refined, agriculture expanded food supplies in some regions, settlements grew into cities, yet infants remained physically fragile in cold conditions through every stage of civilization. A newborn child in an ancient village still faced many of the same biological dangers that existed during prehistoric winters: heat loss, hunger, illness, dampness, weak breathing, exhaustion among caregivers. Human progress reduced some risks gradually, but never erased them completely. This continuity may explain why so many winter caregiving behaviors persisted across cultures and centuries. Parents continued sleeping near infants. Fires remained central to family life during cold months. Communities stored fuel and food obsessively before winter arrived, Grandparents taught younger adults how to recognize signs of illness or dangerous cold exposure in children. Ancient knowledge about winter survival rarely disappeared because each generation still needed it in some form. Even when societies became more advanced politically or economically, the physical reality of caring for infants during freezing seasons remained deeply personal and immediate. Archaeological evidence from different civilizations suggests that families often adapted available technology specifically around the needs of children. Cradles were lined with insulating materials. Bedding systems became thicker and more layered. Indoor spaces were organized around heat retention. Animal products were processed carefully into softer and warmer coverings. Some societies even developed specialized infant clothing suited for local climates. These changes happened gradually across long periods of time, often through accumulated practical experience rather than sudden invention. Human beings rarely solved winter survival through one breakthrough alone. More often, survival improved because thousands of small adjustments slowly worked together. There is also evidence that cultural traditions surrounding infants became closely tied to seasonal awareness. In many societies, winter births carried special concern because newborns entered the world during the harshest environmental conditions. Families prepared differently depending on the season. Certain foods, coverings, or sleeping practices became associated specifically with protecting infants during cold weather. Though beliefs and rituals varied widely, the underlying fear often remained similar. Winter could quietly threaten new life if the community failed to maintain warmth and stability around the child. Over time, human beings also became increasingly skilled at creating indoor environments that extended survival beyond what the body alone could tolerate naturally. Controlled fire, insulated shelter walls, stored fuel, layered fabrics, preserved food, and cooperative caregiving together formed an artificial climate around infants. In a sense, ancient people built small islands of controlled warmth inside environments that remained fundamentally hostile during winter. This ability to reshape surroundings collectively may have been one of humanity's greatest survival advantages. Humans did not grow fur thick enough for Arctic cold. Human infants did not evolve rapid independence after birth. Instead, people transformed behavior, tools, and social structures around weakness itself. Modern life often hides how extraordinary this achievement really was. Heated buildings, stable food systems, medicine, insulated clothing, and reliable fuel supplies create conditions where many parents rarely think consciously about body heat survival from hour to hour. Yet the instincts remain quietly present beneath modern comfort. Adults still pull blankets over sleeping children during cold nights. Parents still wake to listen for breathing. Caregivers still feel immediate concern when an infant's skin seems unusually cold. These responses connect modern humans to ancient generations more closely than most people realize. Somewhere inside human memory, winter remains associated with vigilance around vulnerable life. Perhaps this is why stories of survival during harsh winters continue to feel emotionally powerful across cultures. They remind people of a very old truth. Human beings were never creatures perfectly designed for cold environments. Fragile infants especially revealed those limits clearly. And yet generation after generation, people still carried children through freezing nights, kept fires alive beside sleeping shelters, shared food when supplies weakened, and stayed awake listening for small breaths in darkness until morning finally returned. Civilization itself may have grown from countless acts, like these repeated patiently across the cold seasons of human history. After thousands of years of surviving winter, human beings eventually changed the environment around themselves so completely that many of the old dangers became almost invisible. Fire moved from open flames to enclosed stoves. then to central heating systems hidden behind walls. Animal skins became insulated fabrics. Temporary shelters became houses designed to hold stable indoor temperatures through entire seasons. Food preservation improved. Medicine advanced. Infant mortality declined dramatically in many parts of the world. Modern parents can now protect newborns with technologies ancient people could never have imagined. And yet, beneath all these changes, the biology of the infant body remains remarkably ancient. A newborn today still cannot regulate temperature as effectively as an adult, still depends on constant feeding, still requires warmth, touch, and protection during sleep. Human civilization transformed the world around infants far faster than evolution transformed the infants themselves. Modern science helps explain many survival patterns ancient people discovered through experience alone. Skin-to-skin contact between caregiver and infant is now known to stabilize temperature, breathing, and heart rate in newborns. Breastfeeding provides immune protection and supports energy balance during early development. Dry environments reduce dangerous heat loss. Layered insulation traps warm air effectively. Close observation during illness or temperature stress remains essential because infants can deteriorate quickly. Many practices once developed simply through survival experience now appear supported by medical research. Ancient people lacked scientific language, but much of their winter caregiving reflected careful observation of real biological needs. This does not mean ancient life was ideal or perfectly wise. Many children still died from conditions no one could control or understand fully at the time. Cold exposure, infection, starvation, smoke inhalation, and birth complications remained powerful threats throughout history. Yet human communities continued learning gradually from repeated experience. Knowledge passed quietly between generations through habits rather than textbooks. How to wrap a child against wind, how to recognize dangerous weakness during winter illness, how to position sleeping spaces away from drafts, how to preserve warmth when fuel ran low. Much of human survival depended on these ordinary forms of memory carried inside daily life. Modern comfort can sometimes make ancient winter life difficult to imagine clearly. Heated rooms allow many people to forget how quickly cold affects the human body once protection disappears. Refrigeration hides the uncertainty of food preservation. Electric lighting removes the long darkness that shaped ancient winter psychology. Medicine reduces fears surrounding infant illness that once haunted families through entire seasons. Yet even today, power outages during snowstorms, fuel shortages, displacement, or extreme poverty can reveal how fragile warmth still remains. When heating systems fail, people immediately return to behaviors humans practiced for thousands of years, gathering together in smaller spaces, sharing blankets, conserving fuel, checking on children and elderly family members, repeatedly, protecting the vulnerable first. Ancient survival instincts remain close beneath modern life because the biological realities underneath them never fully disappeared. Winter also continues teaching something deeper about human nature itself. Human beings survived severe climates not primarily through physical strength, but through cooperation focused around vulnerability. Unlike many cold-adapted animals, human infants are born highly dependent and remain fragile for a long time. This weakness forced communities to become attentive, social, and protective. Entire systems of shelter, fire maintenance, food storage, caregiving, and shared labor developed partly because newborn children could not survive winter alone. In this sense, some of humanity's most important social behaviors may have been shaped by the simple need to keep infants warm enough through cold nights. The story of winter survival is therefore not only about climate or hardship, it is also about the slow development of human care itself. Long before written laws, hospitals, or modern science existed, People were already organizing their lives around protecting fragile bodies from cold and hunger. A parent staying awake beside a sleeping infant, someone adding wood to fading embers before dawn, someone drying damp bedding near the fire, someone sharing food with an exhausted nursing mother during a difficult season. These quiet actions helped carry human life through winters long before civilization fully understood what it was doing. And perhaps even now, deep beneath modern comfort, the memory of those ancient nights still remains somewhere inside the human instinct to reach toward warmth when the world grows cold. Perhaps one of the most important lessons hidden inside ancient winter survival is that human life was never protected by strength alone. The people who kept infants alive during freezing seasons were not always the strongest hunters, the fastest travelers, or the most physically powerful members of the group. Often, survival depended on quieter forms of effort that leave little trace in history. Someone noticing that bedding had become damp before nightfall, someone waking repeatedly to feed a child through exhaustion, someone preserving extra fuel before a storm arrived, someone giving warmth, food, or labor to another family whose resources were weakening. These actions rarely appear in monuments or written records, yet they may have mattered more to human survival than many famous battles or rulers remembered today. Ancient winter life reveals how fragile human existence truly was for most of history. A newborn's survival could depend on a fire continuing to burn until dawn, a mother remaining healthy enough to produce milk, a shelter holding against wind during one severe storm. Modern societies often associate progress with control over nature, but ancient winters remind us that human beings spent most of their existence living very close to uncertainty. Cold weather exposed how easily life could shift from stability into danger through small changes accumulating over time. And yet, instead of disappearing under those pressures, humans adapted through patience, observation, memory, and cooperation. This may be one reason human caregiving became so emotionally deep compared to many other species. Human infants remained dependent for an unusually long period after birth. In cold climates, this dependence became even more extreme because newborns could not survive winter independently under almost any circumstances. Adults had to reorganize entire environments around the needs of vulnerable children. Fire placement, sleeping arrangements, migration timing, food storage, clothing production, and labor distribution were all shaped partly by the physical weakness of infants. In a quiet way, fragile children helped shape the structure of human society itself. Ancient people may not have described this philosophically, but their daily actions reflected it constantly. There is also something deeply human in the fact that so much winter survival depended on ordinary repetition, not dramatic heroism, not constant crisis, simply continuing the same protective actions day after day for months. Drying bedding again, repairing shelter walls again, gathering fuel again, checking breathing again during the night. Human beings survived long winters partly because caregivers accepted endless small responsibilities without immediate reward or certainty of success. Some children still died despite every effort. Yet people continued trying through each new season. The persistence itself became part of survival. Modern life sometimes hides the importance of these quiet forms of labor because many protections now operate automatically through infrastructure and technology. Heating systems maintain warmth without constant fire tending. Hospitals intervene during illness. Refrigeration protects food supplies. Insulated buildings reduce exposure to weather, but underneath modern convenience, the ancient structure of care still remains recognizable. Human beings continue protecting vulnerable lives through repeated attention, shared labor, and maintenance of safe environments. Parents still lose sleep caring for newborns. Communities still respond collectively during disasters or winter emergencies. Warmth, Food, shelter, and caregiving still form the foundation beneath every advanced society. Perhaps this is why stories about ancient survival continue to feel strangely familiar despite the distance of time. The technologies were different, but the emotional realities remain recognizable. Fear when a child becomes weak. Relief when warmth returns after danger passes. Exhaustion mixed with responsibility during long nights of caregiving. Hope carried quietly through difficult seasons. These experiences connect modern humans to people who lived thousands of years ago more directly than many realize. Winter may have changed human history not only by forcing people to invent better tools or shelters, but by teaching generations that survival often depends on protecting those least able to protect themselves. And somewhere in the silence of ancient winter nights, beside smoke-darkened shelters and fading fires, that lesson was repeated over and over again, while adults listened carefully for the breathing of sleeping children. When we look back at ancient winters, it is easy to focus on the cold itself, the snow, the darkness, the storms, the frozen landscapes stretching beyond small shelters lit by weak firelight. But perhaps the most important part of the story was never the winter alone, it was the human response to it. Again and again, across thousands of years, people faced conditions that the human body was never perfectly designed to endure. Newborn children entered a world where a single freezing night could become dangerous if warmth failed for only a few hours. And still, generation after generation, human beings continued finding ways to protect life inside that cold. Not perfectly, not without loss, but often enough for humanity itself to continue. Ancient people survived winter because they slowly learned that survival was rarely an individual act. A child lived because many forms of care overlapped at once. Someone maintained the shelter. Someone gathered fuel before snow arrived. Someone repaired clothing before temperatures dropped. Someone stayed awake feeding a baby beside fading embers. Someone listened during the night for breathing in darkness. These actions appeared small when viewed alone, yet together they formed the invisible structure supporting human survival through countless winters. Modern science can now explain much of what ancient people discovered through experience. Warmth stabilizes infant physiology. Nutrition protects against cold stress. Skin contact regulates breathing and temperature. Dry environments reduce dangerous heat loss. Cooperative caregiving improves survival during hardship. But scientific explanation does not reduce the human meaning behind those ancient acts of care. If anything, it reveals how carefully generations observed the fragile needs of children long before they possessed written biology or medicine. There is also a quiet humility hidden inside this history. Human beings often imagine survival as strength, overcoming weakness. Yet winter repeatedly showed the opposite. The survival of entire communities depended on protecting those who were weakest. Infants could not gather fuel, build shelters, hunt animals, or defend themselves from storms. And still, entire systems of human behavior evolved around keeping them alive. In this way, vulnerability itself shaped civilization. The need to protect fragile children encouraged cooperation, planning, memory, patience, and shared responsibility across generations. Some of the most important human qualities may have grown not from dominance over nature, but from the long effort to care for vulnerable life within it. Even now, traces of those ancient winters remain inside ordinary human behavior. A parent checking if a child feels too cold during sleep, someone instinctively pulling a blanket higher over another person during the night, families gathering together during storms or power outages, communities bringing food, warmth, and shelter to vulnerable people during disasters. These reactions are deeply old. Long before modern technology existed, humans survived by learning that warmth had to be shared carefully when conditions became harsh. Perhaps this is why stories of winter survival still feel emotionally close to us today. Beneath modern life, people still recognize the ancient fear of cold, darkness, hunger, and isolation. But they also recognize something else, the relief of warmth returning, the comfort of another human presence nearby, the quiet safety created when someone chooses to care for another vulnerable person through a difficult night. In the end, the story of how ancient people kept babies alive during freezing winters is not only about climate, shelters, or survival techniques. It is also about the slow creation of human care itself. Fire alone did not carry humanity through winter. Neither did fur, food, or shelter by themselves. Human beings survived because they remained willing to protect fragile life, even when conditions were exhausting, uncertain, and unforgiving. And perhaps somewhere beyond history, beyond archaeology, beyond written memory, one question still remains quietly waiting in the darkness. If warmth and survival have always depended so deeply on how humans care for one another, then what does that say about what it truly means to be human at all?